The alien mother's desperation. Sierra crouched behind a stack of metal crates, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold wind of the human colony's industrial district whipped through her tattered cloak. She adjusted the fabric around her daughter, Renix, who lay unconscious in her arms. Her small, delicate face was pale, her breathing shallow. Every breath was a struggle, and Sierra knew she was running out of time. The Lyrexian mother looked around nervously, her large, luminous eyes scanning the dimly lit alley. Humans were everywhere. They moved about, carrying tools, talking in loud voices, and working on the towering machines that loomed over the streets. Sierra had been warned about humans her entire life. Her people called them dangerous, unpredictable creatures, quick to anger and impossible to trust. But now she had no choice. Her people, the Lyrexians, had cast her out. They had called her weak, unworthy, a disgrace. And when her daughter had fallen ill, they had refused to help. Sierra clenched her jaw, anger and despair swirling inside her. She had begged, pleaded with the council, but they had turned their backs on her. To them, she was as good as dead. A sudden noise startled her. Heavy footsteps echoed down the alley, and Sierra shrank further into the shadows. A figure appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, walking with a purposeful stride. It was a human man, his face rugged and weathered, his clothes smudged with oil and grime. He carried a toolbox in one hand and muttered something under his breath as he approached a nearby workshop. Sierra held her breath, hoping he wouldn't notice her. But as he passed the crates, he stopped abruptly. His sharp eyes scanned the shadows, and his gaze locked onto her. "Hey," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Who's there?" Sierra froze, clutching Renix tighter. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The man stepped closer, his expression shifting from suspicion to curiosity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone softening. Then his eyes fell on the bundle in her arms. "Is that a kid?" Sierra hesitated. This was a human. Could she really trust him? But what choice did she have? Slowly, she loosened the cloak, revealing her daughter's face. The man's eyes widened slightly, but to her surprise, there was no fear or disgust, only concern. "She's sick," Sierra said, her voice trembling. "She needs help." The man knelt down, setting his toolbox aside. "What kind of help?" he asked, his tone serious. "We've got a clinic nearby." "No," Sierra said quickly. "They won't. They can't treat her. She needs a medpod." The man frowned, clearly puzzled. "Medpod? Like alien tech? Those are restricted around here." "I know," Sierra said, her voice cracking. "But she won't survive without it." The man looked at her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Then he stood up, scratching the back of his neck. "All right," he said finally. "Let's get her inside. We'll figure something out." Sierra blinked, stunned. "You're helping me." He shrugged. "I'm Ethan. I don't like seeing kids suffer. Now come on before someone spots you." Still unsure if she could trust him, Sierra followed Ethan into the workshop. It was cluttered and noisy, filled with tools, spare parts, and half-built machines. Ethan cleared a space on a workbench, motioning for her to set Renix down. "She's burning up," Ethan muttered, placing a hand on the child's forehead. "How long has she been like this?" 2 days, Sierra said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hasn't woken up since." Ethan rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a small scanner. "This isn't exactly alien-grade tech," he said, switching it on. "But it might give us an idea of what's going on." Sierra watched anxiously as he scanned Renix. The device beeped, and Ethan frowned at the results. "Her system's shutting down," he said grimly. "Whatever's wrong with her, it's way beyond anything I've seen." Tears welled up in Sierra's eyes. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "You have to help her." Ethan looked at her, his expression hardening with resolve. "I don't know much about alien medpods," he said, "but I know where we might find one. It's risky, though." I'll do anything, Sierra said, her desperation clear. Just tell me what to do. Ethan nodded. All right. There's an alien supply depot on the other side of the colony. They keep restricted tech there. If we can sneak in, we might be able to grab what we need. Sierra's heart raced. A supply depot meant guards, alarms, and danger. But it also meant a chance, a slim, fragile chance to save her daughter. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice trembling. Ethan looked at her, his eyes steady. Because no one deserves to watch their kid die, he said simply. Now let's move before someone comes looking for us. For the first time in days, Sierra felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know if she could trust this human, but she had no other choice. Cradling Renix in her arms, she followed Ethan into the night, her heart filled with both fear and determination. The fight to save her daughter had just begun, a human's unlikely promise. Ethan Carter leaned against the metal door of his workshop, staring at the unconscious alien child. Her breathing was faint, and her translucent skin shimmered under the dim light, a stark reminder of how fragile she was. Across the room, Sierra sat on the edge of a workbench, her luminous eyes locked on Ethan. She still didn't trust him, not fully, but desperation forced her to stay. The silence between them was broken by the distant hum of security drones patrolling the colony streets. Ethan glanced at the window, his jaw tightening. They'll be looking for you soon, he said, especially after that stunt you pulled crossing into human territory. Sierra flinched, her grip tightening on the edge of the bench. I didn't have a choice, she replied softly. They turned me away. My own people refused to help us. Ethan's expression softened. He didn't need to ask why. He'd seen enough of the galaxy to know how unforgiving it could be. Well, you're here now, he said, pushing off the door and grabbing a datapad from his cluttered desk. Let's focus on keeping your kid alive. Sierra watched as Ethan tapped on the screen, his fingers moving quickly. You said she needs a medpod, he muttered. The only place you'll find one is at the alien supply depot on the colony's outskirts. Problem is, it's locked down tighter than a banker's vault. Her heart sank. Is there no other way? She asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stopped typing and looked at her. Not unless you want to wait for her condition to get worse. Do you? Sierra shook her head, biting her lip. Waiting wasn't an option. Ethan leaned on the desk, folding his arms. All right, listen. Breaking into that depot is suicide without a plan. Lucky for you, I've got a knack for getting into places I shouldn't. Her eyes widened. You've done this before. Let's just say I've had my share of disagreements with authority, he replied with a smirk. But this time, it's not just about sneaking in. We need to find the medpod, grab it, and get out without triggering half the colony's security force. Sierra hesitated. Why are you doing this for us? You don't even know me. Ethan's smirk faded, replaced by a serious expression. Because I know what it feels like to lose someone, he said quietly, and I'm not about to stand by and watch it happen again. The words hit Sierra harder than she expected. She had spent so long being rejected and judged that she'd forgotten what kindness looked like. But even now, part of her questioned his motives. Could a human really be this selfless? Ethan didn't wait for her response. He grabbed a small bag and started stuffing it with tools and devices. The depot's not far, but we'll need to move fast. They'd got patrols all over the place. If we're caught, they'll lock us up, or worse. As he spoke, the faint hum of drones grew louder. Sierra tensed, her sharp hearing picking up the telltale clicks of scanners sweeping the area. They're close, she whispered, her voice urgent. Ethan grabbed a device from the table and tossed it to her. That's a signal scrambler. It'll keep their scanners from picking you up. Just stay close to me. Sierra stared at the device, unsure of how it worked. I don't know how to use this. You don't have to, Ethan said, pulling a small earpiece from his bag and placing it in his ear. I'll handle the tech. You just make sure you don't slow me down. Before she could respond, Ethan opened a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a narrow passage that led out of the workshop. "This way," he said, motioning for her to follow. Sierra scooped up her daughter and hurried after him, the scrambler clutched tightly in her hand. The passage was dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound a potential threat. "Why do humans have these tunnels?" Sierra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan glanced back at her. "We don't. This is my personal shortcut. Let's just say I like having options." They emerged on the other side of the colony, near a cluster of storage buildings. Ethan crouched low, scanning the area. "The depot's just up ahead," he said, pointing to a sleek, high-security building surrounded by automated turrets and patrolling drones. "Now comes the hard part." Sierra's stomach twisted at the sight. "You're sure you can get us inside?" Ethan grinned, pulling a small device from his bag. "I've broken into worse. Trust me." Before she could argue, he motioned for her to stay close and started moving toward the depot. Sierra followed, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, but it was fragile, like a single flame in the dark. As they approached the depot, Ethan's voice came through her earpiece. "Keep your head down and don't make a sound. If this works, we'll be in and out before they even know we're here." But deep down, Sierra couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was ever that simple. A world that rejects them. The depot's doors slammed shut behind them, sealing Ethan, Sierra, and her unconscious daughter in the dimly lit storage bay. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of alien tech and Sierra's shaky breathing. Renix's condition was worsening, and time was running out. Ethan leaned against a crate, catching his breath. "Well, that could have gone worse," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Sierra shot him a glare. "You call nearly being vaporized by a turret not bad." "Hey," Ethan replied, grinning through his exhaustion. "We're alive, aren't we? That's a win in my book." Sierra ignored him, her focus on her daughter. Renix's face was pale, her fragile form trembling with each shallow breath. The Lyrexian mother's heart ached as she cradled her child. "Where is the medpod?" she demanded, her voice sharp with urgency. Ethan stood, glancing around the storage bay. "It should be here," he said, pulling out his datapad and scanning the area. The device pinged, and he pointed to a set of large crates on the far side of the room. "There. Let's move." As they crossed the bay, the floor panels beneath them flickered with faint red lights. Sierra froze. "What's that?" Ethan's face darkened. "Security sensors," he muttered. "We tripped them." Before Sierra could respond, the bay was flooded with a blaring alarm. Automated turrets descended from the ceiling, their barrels glowing ominously. A mechanical voice echoed through the room. "Unauthorized access detected. Surrender immediately." "Great," Ethan grumbled, pulling a small device from his belt. "I was hoping for a quiet night. What are you doing?" Sierra hissed as he began fiddling with the device. "Buying us time," he replied, tossing the device into the air. It emitted a burst of electromagnetic energy, temporarily disabling the turrets. "That won't hold them for long. Let's go." They sprinted to the crates, Sierra struggling to keep up while carrying Renix. Ethan pried open the largest crate, revealing the sleek, cylindrical medpod inside. "Found it," he exclaimed. Sierra's relief was short-lived. The sound of boots echoed from the corridor outside. "They're coming," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. Ethan glanced at the medpod, and then at the sealed doors. "We don't have time to move this thing. We'll have to activate it here." Sierra's eyes widened. "Here? In the middle of a security lockdown? Unless you've got a better idea." Ethan shot back, already working on the pod's control panel. Sierra bit her lip, her instincts screaming at her to flee. But one look at her daughter reminded her there was no turning back. She carefully placed Renix inside the pod, her hands trembling as the machine began to hum to life. Come on," Ethan muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. This tech is alien grade, but the interface is a nightmare. The door to the bay burst open, and a squad of Lyrexian enforcers stormed in, their weapons aimed at the pair. "Freeze," one of them barked. "Step away from the medpod." Shiara's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. It belonged to her brother, Kel, a high-ranking enforcer who had been instrumental in her exile. His piercing gaze landed on her, and his expression twisted with disgust. "Shiara," Kel spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Still causing trouble, I see. You've disgraced our family enough. Stand down before you make this worse." Ethan stepped in front of Shiara, his stance defiant. "Back off, pal. We're not leaving without that kid." Cal's eyes narrowed. "And who is this? Human?" he sneered. "A scavenger. A thief. Do you have any idea what you're meddling with? I know enough to see you're letting a kid die because of some twisted sense of pride." Ethan shot back. "So why don't you drop the act and do something useful for once?" Cal's face darkened, and he raised his weapon. "You have no right to speak of pride, human. This is Lyrexian justice." "Justice?" Chiara's voice trembled with anger. "You call abandoning your own blood justice?" Cale hesitated, but his grip on his weapon didn't falter. "You brought this on yourself, Chiara. You chose to defy our laws, to shame our family." "I chose to protect my daughter," Chiara snapped, stepping forward. "And I won't let you take that away from me." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Ethan glanced between the siblings, his mind racing. He needed a way to buy time. "Look," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You've got me. I'm just a human trying to help. Let the girl finish her treatment, and I'll go quietly." Chiara's eyes widened. "Ethan, no. Trust me," he whispered, cutting her off. Cale smirked, lowering his weapon slightly. "A noble sacrifice. Perhaps humans aren't as selfish as I thought." Ethan gave a small, sarcastic bow. "Glad to change your mind." But as Cale signaled for his squad to advance, Ethan pressed a hidden button on his wristband. A sharp, blinding flash filled the room, disorienting the enforcers. "Run," Ethan shouted, grabbing Chiara's arm. They bolted for cover as the medpod finished its sequence, sealing Renix inside. The child's vitals stabilized, but the pod would need time to complete the treatment. Time they didn't have. "Stay down," Ethan muttered, pulling Chiara into the shadows. "This is going to get messy." As the enforcers regrouped, Chiara realized one thing. Ethan wasn't just a mechanic. He was a fighter, a survivor. And for the first time, she dared to believe they might actually make it out alive. The daughter's life at stake. The medpod emitted a soft hum, its lights casting an otherworldly glow on Renix's fragile face. Chiara knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the glass. The pod was working, stabilizing her daughter's condition, but the process wasn't complete. They needed more time. Behind her, Ethan was barricading the workshop door with anything he could find. Scrap metal, tools, and a half-built engine. "They'll break through eventually," he said, his voice tense. "We've got maybe 10 minutes if we're lucky." Chiara didn't respond. Her focus was on her daughter, whose breathing had become steadier but was still shallow. Every moment felt like an eternity. "Hey," Ethan said sharply, pulling her attention back to him. "I know you're worried, but we need to move. That medpod won't help if we're all caught or dead." Chiara's heart twisted with guilt. She knew he was right, but leaving now felt like abandoning her child. "If we move her, the pod will shut down," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She'll die." Ethan's face hardened. "Then we need to buy her more time." Before Chiara could ask what he meant, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the workshop. The Lyrexian enforcers were back, and this time, they weren't taking chances. A deep mechanical voice boomed through a speaker. Surrender now, or we will breach the door. You have 30 seconds. Sierra felt a wave of panic wash over her. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small spherical device. Smoke grenade, he explained. It won't stop them, but it'll give us some cover. Her eyes widened. Cover for what? Ethan smiled grimly. For me to do something stupid. Before she could protest, he tossed the grenade toward the door. The room filled with thick, choking smoke as the grenade detonated, obscuring their view of the entrance. Sierra coughed. Her vision blurred, but she could still hear Ethan moving. What are you doing? She shouted, trying to follow him through the haze. Buying time, he replied, his voice steady. Get behind cover and stay low. Sierra hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect her daughter and her growing concern for Ethan. But as the sound of the door being breached filled the room, she had no choice. She crouched behind the medpod, her heart pounding. The enforcers stormed in, their glowing weapons slicing through the smoke like blades. Find the intruders, one of them barked. Ethan struck first. From the shadows, he tackled the nearest enforcer, disarming him in a fluid motion. The room erupted into chaos as Ethan fought with a ferocity Sierra hadn't expected. For a human, he was surprisingly strong and fast. But it wasn't enough. The enforcers were better equipped, and their numbers were overwhelming. Ethan managed to hold them off for a while, but he was quickly cornered. Stop! Sierra shouted, stepping out from behind the medpod. Her hands were raised, her voice trembling. Stop, or I'll destroy the pod. The enforcers froze, their weapons trained on her. Cale, her brother, stepped forward, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. You wouldn't, he said, his voice cold. Try me. Sierra replied, her gaze steady despite the fear coursing through her. You leave us alone, or you'll lose the medpod and my daughter. Cale's jaw tightened. You're willing to risk her life. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to protect her, Sierra said firmly. Something you wouldn't understand. The room fell silent, the tension thick. Ethan, bloody but still standing, looked at Sierra with a mix of admiration and concern. That's one way to negotiate, he muttered. Cale's gaze shifted between Sierra and the medpod. Finally, he lowered his weapon. You've always been stubborn, he said bitterly. But this isn't over. He motioned for his squad to stand down, and the enforcers retreated, leaving the room in uneasy silence. Sierra let out a shaky breath, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Ethan walked over, wincing as he clutched his side. You all right? He asked. She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I didn't think they'd back down. They didn't, Ethan said grimly. They're just regrouping. We need a plan, and fast. Sierra glanced at the medpod. Its soft hum a reminder of the fragile life it was sustaining. We can't move her, she said quietly. Not until the treatment is finished. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. Then we make our stand here, he said. If they come back, we fight. Sierra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why risk your life for us? Ethan smiled faintly. Because sometimes, doing the right thing is worth the risk. For the first time, Sierra felt a flicker of hope. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but they weren't out of options. And as long as Ethan was by her side, she believed they might just stand a chance. Betrayed by blood, the tension in the air was suffocating. Sierra sat slumped against the medpod, clutching her unconscious daughter's hand through the transparent casing. The hum of the device was the only sound keeping her grounded, a faint promise of life in a moment when everything seemed on the brink of collapse. Ethan paced near the barricaded entrance, his movements sharp and deliberate despite the bruises spreading across his face. He adjusted the improvised defenses he had set up, more out of instinct than hope. They'll be back soon, he muttered, breaking the silence. We've got to be ready. Shiera didn't respond. Her luminous eyes stared blankly at the door, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. Her brother, Kale, hadn't just stormed in with his enforcers. He had looked her in the eye and called her an unworthy mother. The sting of his words lingered even now. The silence didn't last long. A heavy knock echoed from the door, followed by a familiar, authoritative voice. "Sahara, it's me." Her heart sank. "Kale." Ethan shot her a look, his expression hardening. "Don't answer." But Shiera stood, her knees shaking as she moved toward the door. "He won't leave unless I speak to him," she said quietly. Ethan grabbed her arm. "He's not here to talk, Shiera." She pulled away, her gaze resolute. "He's my brother." Ethan sighed but stepped back, readying his weapon. "Fine, but the moment he tries anything, I'm not holding back." Shiera pressed a button, and the door slid open just enough to reveal Cal's face. His piercing eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something, regret, sadness. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Shiera," Cal said, his tone cold and clipped. "You've caused enough chaos. Surrender now, and I'll ensure your daughter's treatment is completed." Shiera's jaw clenched. "You mean you'll take her from me?" she replied bitterly. "Like everything else." Cal didn't flinch. "You brought this on yourself. You defied the council, disobeyed our laws, and now you've dragged humans into our affairs. Do you even understand the damage you've caused? I understand that my daughter is alive because of that human." Shiera snapped, her voice rising. "Something you and the council refused to do." Cal's expression darkened. "That human is nothing more than a scavenger and a brute. He's using you." "Using me?" Shiera's laugh was hollow. "He's risked everything for us. More than you ever have." The words hit Cal like a physical blow, but he recovered quickly. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Shiera," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Hand over the human, and I'll ensure you and your daughter are spared." Shiera froze. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Cal wasn't bluffing. She knew him too well for that. But the thought of betraying Ethan, the man who had fought tooth and nail to save them, was unbearable. "I won't do it," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." Cal's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "Don't make me do this, Shiera. You're forcing my hand." The sound of a weapon charging snapped Shiera out of her thoughts. Ethan stepped into view, his blaster aimed squarely at Cal. "I think this conversation is over," he said, his tone calm but deadly. "You want to fight? Let's go." Cal stared at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then, to Shiera's shock, he lowered his weapon. "Fine," he said. "But remember this, sister, when this is over, and you've lost everything, you'll see that I was right." He turned and walked away, leaving the door open just long enough for Shiera to catch a glimpse of the enforcers waiting in the shadows. The message was clear. This wasn't over. Ethan exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon. "That went better than I expected." Shiera glared at him. "He's not done. He's testing me." "Yeah, well, he's about to fail that test," Ethan said, moving back to the barricade. "We've got the medpod working, and we're not leaving without your daughter." Shiera sank to the floor, her hands trembling. "He's my brother, Ethan. I don't know if I can do this." Ethan knelt beside her, his gaze steady. "He might be your brother, but he's also the guy who left you to fend for yourself. You don't owe him anything." She looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and fear. "What if he's right? What if I've made everything worse?" Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've made mistakes. Welcome to being alive. But you're fighting for your daughter, and that makes you stronger than he'll ever be." The words settled over her like a blanket, calming the storm inside her. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right," she said quietly. "We fight." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's the spirit. Now let's get ready. They'll be back soon." And as Ciara returned to her daughter's side, she realized something. She wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in a long time, she had someone she could trust, and that gave her the strength to face whatever came next. Humanity's greatest strength. The sound of the barricade crashing down reverberated through the workshop like a thunderclap. Sparks flew as the makeshift defenses collapsed, sending shards of metal skittering across the floor. Ciara stood in front of the medpod, her daughter's fragile form glowing faintly inside the device. Her body trembled, but her hands held firm on the alien weapon Ethan had handed her moments earlier. Ethan, battered but unbroken, stood beside her. His stance was defiant, his blaster aimed at the gaping entrance, now filled with the silhouettes of Lyrexian enforcers. His voice was steady, even as adrenaline surged through him. "You picked the wrong night to mess with a human," he growled. Cale stepped into the light, his uniform pristine despite the chaos. His gaze was cold, calculating, as it swept over the scene. "You've made your choice, Ciara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And it will cost you everything." Ethan smirked, raising his weapon. Big talk for a guy who hasn't won yet. Cale ignored him, his focus solely on Ciara. "Surrender now, and I'll ensure your daughter is taken care of. Continue this madness, and you'll lose her." Ciara's grip on the weapon tightened. Her heart screamed at her to protect Renix at all costs, but her brother's words cut deep. Could she really defy him and risk everything? She glanced at Ethan, who nodded firmly. "You've got this," he whispered. "Don't let him scare you." The confidence in his voice steadied her. Ciara stepped forward, her weapon aimed squarely at Cale. "I won't let you take her," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not now. Not ever." Cale's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Ethan took a step forward, cutting the tension with a sharp laugh. "All right, enough talk," he said. "Let's settle this." Cale raised his hand, signaling his enforcers. They surged forward, their weapons glowing as they unleashed a barrage of energy blasts. Ethan dove behind a workbench, returning fire with precision that spoke of years of experience. Ciara followed, her movements hesitant but determined. The workshop erupted into chaos. Sparks flew as energy bolts ricocheted off machinery and walls, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Ethan's voice cut through the noise. "Ciara, keep them away from the pod." "I'm trying," she shouted, firing her weapon at an advancing enforcer. The recoil nearly knocked her off balance, but the shot hit its mark, sending the attacker sprawling. Cale moved with cold efficiency, his weapon aimed not at Ethan but at the medpod. He fired, and the shot grazed the pod's casing, sending a crack spidering across the glass. "No," Ciara screamed, her fear turning into fury. She charged at her brother, her weapon forgotten as she tackled him to the ground. Cale's surprise was brief. He recovered quickly, grabbing her wrists and pinning her down. "You've always been reckless," he hissed, "and look where it's gotten you." Ciara struggled against him, her strength no match for his, but before he could press his advantage, Ethan appeared, slamming the butt of his blaster into Cale's head. The Lyrexian enforcer collapsed, unconscious. "Nice work," Ethan said, helping Ciara to her feet. "But maybe don't charge a guy with a gun next time." She glared at him, but there was no time for an argument. The remaining enforcers were regrouping, their weapons glowing ominously. Ethan tossed her another device, a small cylindrical object with a blinking red light. "Last chance. You ready to make some noise?" "What is this?" she asked, her voice edged with panic. "Improvised explosive," he replied with a grin. "Let's hope it works." Ciara hesitated, but the determination in Ethan's eyes gave her the courage she needed. She pressed the button on the device and hurled it toward the enforcers. The explosion was deafening, a shockwave of light and sound that sent the attackers sprawling. In the sudden silence, Ciara turned to Ethan, her heart pounding. "Is it over?" "Not quite," he said, motioning to the medpod. The pod's damaged. We need to stabilize it. She rushed to the device, her hands trembling as she assessed the damage. The crack in the glass was growing, and the pod's hum had turned into a weak, irregular whine. "It's losing power," she said desperately. "It can't finish the treatment." Ethan pulled off his jacket, revealing a bandaged wound on his arm. "Maybe it doesn't need to," he said, kneeling beside the pod. "Human blood's adaptable, right? Let's give it a shot." Shiera stared at him, horrified. "You could die." He met her gaze, his expression serious. "So could she. Let's not waste time." Before she could protest, he connected his wound to the pod's intake valve. The device beeped erratically, then steadied as the blood flowed into its system. The lights brightened, the hum returning to its steady rhythm. "You're insane," Shiera said, tears streaming down her face. Ethan smirked weakly. "Yeah, but it's working, isn't it?" As the medpod resumed its work, Shiera knelt beside Ethan, her hand gripping his. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. Together, they had defied the odds. And as the distant sound of reinforcements echoed through the workshop, she knew one thing. They weren't giving up without a fight. A new family. The medpod's soft hum filled the workshop, but now it carried a sense of finality. The cracks in its casing still glowed faintly, but the treatment was complete. Sierra knelt beside it, staring through the transparent panel at her daughter, Renix, who was finally breathing steadily. Her pale skin had regained its vibrant glow, and for the first time in days, Sierra felt her heart lighten. Ethan sat slumped against a wall, his face pale but defiant. A makeshift bandage covered his arm where he'd connected to the medpod, his blood the final piece that had saved Renix's life. His trademark smirk lingered, even through his exhaustion. "Told you it'd work," he said weakly. Sierra turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Maybe," Ethan replied, his grin widening. "But the kid's alive, and that's what matters." Before Xiara could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the distance. The enforcers were regrouping, their approach methodical and unrelenting. There wouldn't be any time to rest. "They're coming back," Xiara said, her voice tight with fear. "We can't fight them again." Ethan struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a nearby workbench. "We're not fighting," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We're leaving." She blinked at him in disbelief. "How?" "The building is surrounded. There's no way out." Ethan smirked, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small cylindrical device. "There's always a way out," he said. "You just have to make one." The device beeped softly as he activated it, the countdown flashing on its display. Sierra's eyes widened. "Is that smoke charge?" he said quickly, cutting her off. "Not lethal, but it'll blind them long enough for us to slip out." He turned to the medpod, his expression hardening. "We'll have to carry it. Can you handle that?" Sierra nodded, her determination outweighing her fear. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan gave her a small, approving nod. "Good. Let's move." The moment the charge detonated, the room was filled with dense, choking smoke. The enforcers shouted in confusion as visibility dropped to zero. Xiara and Ethan moved quickly, her arms wrapped around the medpod while he cleared the path ahead. Every step felt like a gamble, the air thick with tension and danger. They burst into the open air, the night sky a welcome sight despite the chaos behind them. Ethan led the way, his movements purposeful despite his injuries. "This way," he said, motioning toward a narrow alley. "I've got a ship hidden nearby." Chiara didn't question him. She focused on keeping the medpod steady, her heart pounding with every step. Behind them, the enforcers' shouts grew louder as they realized their targets had escaped. Ethan's ship was a battered freighter, its exterior scared and worn. But to Xiara, it looked like salvation. "Get inside," he said, ushering her up the ramp. "I'll handle takeoff." She obeyed, setting the medpod down carefully before collapsing beside it. Her body ached, but relief washed over her as she realized they had made it. At least for now. Ethan joined her moments later, slumping into the pilot's seat and activating the ship's engines. The freighter roared to life, its thrusters shaking the ground as it lifted off. The colony shrank beneath them, its lights fading into the darkness of space. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the faint beep of the medpod. Tiara stared at her daughter, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "She's going to be okay," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. "You both are." Sierra turned to him, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Ethan shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Don't mention it. Just doing the right thing." But Sierra shook her head. "No, you've done more than that. You've given us a chance, a future. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Ethan leaned back in his seat, his smile softening. "You already have," he said. "You showed me that fighting for the right cause still matters." The word hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had formed. They were two unlikely allies, brought together by desperation and determination. And now, they were something more, a team, a family. As the freighter disappeared into the stars, Sierra allowed herself to hope. The galaxy was vast and unforgiving, but she wasn't alone anymore. With Ethan by her side, she knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in her life, she believed in a future worth fighting for.